If you're a victim, that doesn't mean you have to stay a victim. If you're in a situation where you're dealing with a toxic person, that doesn't mean you have to stick around and be the victim of that toxic person. If you were in an abusive situation, that doesn't mean you have to carry the baggage of that abuse that you were in that relationship. Here's the thing, hurt people hurt people. But let me also say this. I mean, that's a very common statement that we hear a lot today. A hurt person typically hurts another person, right? Yes. Well, let me just say this. A toxic person creates another toxic person. Welcome to the Free and Redeem podcast. I am your host, Simon Andrade, and here on this specific show, we tackle over key topics that every single Christian struggles with. We bring in guests, we bring in godly wisdom, and more importantly, we bring in scriptures in the Bible to help you enhance your walk with God, bring in confidence, and put you into the direction of freedom and grace by the power of the Holy Spirit. If you're new to this platform, I encourage you to subscribe. With all that being said, guys, let's get started with today's episode. What is up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Free and Redeem podcast. As you know, I am your host, Simon, and today we are going to be talking about 5 signs you are dealing with the toxic person. But before we get into that, if you're new to this channel, welcome. Glad you're here. Don't forget to hit that like button, hit subscribe. We are posting content every other Saturday. But today's episode I am pretty excited about because last episode we talked about the different types of relationships, which, as we all know, there are just a wide variety of people that we get involved with. Not even so much romantic, but even the relationships with our family, the relationships with our friends, people we get close to at our job or connect with at our jobs or business or whatever it may be. And a lot of times today, I don't think we really expect the impacts that some people may have on us. In the last episode, the whole entire concept of a toxic person or a toxic relationship is something that could really be considered dangerous and probably should be avoided. But what does it really mean not to so much be involved in a toxic relationship? What does it mean to be involved with a person who is toxic? That is a pretty tough label to put on someone, is labeling them toxic. But I do believe this is possible, and I do believe there are some people that have a toxic personality or toxic characteristics that either they don't realize that they're pushing onto other people, or they just choose not to hold themselves accountable to it. So getting into today's episode, we're going to talk about 5 signs you may be dealing with a toxic person. Before I fully get into those 5 signs, I want to make this pretty clear. Again, this is for any kind of relationship. I mean, it could apply obviously to romantic relationships, to marriages. Obviously, this does involve friendships. It does involve work-like relationships and just the different types of people we involve ourselves with. And another thing we have to understand too is these are 2 big points I think I just want to get out of the way. Number 1 is everybody has a toxic side to them. What do I mean when I say that? Well, let's just get this out of the way. We all have flaws. None of us are perfect. All of us have something about us that may come off as annoying, frustrating, or overall just overwhelming towards another individual. And in a way, these flaws, I mean, here's the thing, we're not here to please everybody, but at times this could really we could really get under people's skin at times. Good example I could really give is, if I could use myself as an example, a toxic thing that I've realized that I had a habit of doing over the years is I come off very outspoken at times. And sometimes I'll make a joke, I'll say something that, that comes off very straightforward or unexpected. And at times I don't realize how offensive it could really be to the individual I'm joking around with. And at times, it could be offensive. And that's just a very small example. But what I mean is this, is like, look, we all have something about us that could potentially affect another person. And really, at the end of the day, that's not our fault. But what makes it different between a person who has a healthy personality versus a person who has a toxic personality? Well, a person with a toxic personality really honestly just doesn't choose to recognize it. And if they do recognize it, it's just really up to them at the end of the day if they're going to hold themselves accountable. So going into the first sign of how you know you're dealing with a toxic person, this is going to be a pretty bold statement, but let's just kind of get this out of the way, is toxic people usually have a good impression on others. That's pretty big. It's a big statement. What do I mean when I say this? Well, first of all, let's ask this question. Is it wrong to set a good impression on other people? No, of course not. But I'll say it like this. A toxic person usually doesn't come off as a person who's mean or who's, who comes off very aggressive or, something like a person where you look at them and you're like, gosh, I don't want to be around this person. They seem mean. They seem toxic. In so many words, what I'm trying to say is this, is a true toxic person doesn't come off wrong or doesn't throw off red flags right away. Most times out of 10, they come off charming. They come off nice. They come off friendly. Not to say that's a bad thing, but I want to really just throw this out here. What's pretty tough about people that have a toxic personality or toxic characteristics is like when you meet somebody for the first time, you have a conversation with them, you don't really know who they really are. You don't know what they're capable of. You don't know what their flaws are, what their good side is, what their bad side is. Most of the time, you want to see how they are when you first meet them. And I think that's the really toughest part about someone who's dealing with a toxic characteristic or toxic personality is most people that you are meeting, it's just like this could be somebody who's dealing with, deep emotional baggage, a heavy weight of emotional baggage. A lot of times, this is the challenge I think a lot of people face in work-like environments or in job environments, especially with their employers. Most times I've seen this before with a lot of friends who have vented to me about their jobs, and I've even personally gone through this as well. But this is an example I can give. What makes work-like environments very stressful, or I would say extremely toxic at times, is just that first impression you really got from the employer, from the job interview. They come off very friendly, they come off very nice, and they seem like a person you want to work with. But as time goes on, it's like you kind of start to see the negative side of them, maybe the unprofessional side of them, or the side of them that you just did not see when you first met them. That's just a small analogy, but this is basically for any kind of relationship. And a lot of times today, it's just like when we think of the specific sign of somebody who sets good impressions on others, there's a difference between a person who's just putting on an act and just being charming because they know this is exactly what's going to get people to like them. And a toxic person is more concerned about charming another individual versus actually just being honest of who they really are. What does it mean? What's that big difference? Well, to be honest about who you really are, a lot of times today, people like to put on a mask on who they want people to see. I'm just going to give this example, and I'm going to keep this story a little bit confidential because of, I guess, some of the people I still talk to. But for example, this one specific time, there was a person, and it was a girl, she was a good friend of mine, and she was very new to an organization that I used to be a part of. Or she used to be a part of this, it was like almost pretty much like a work organization. When I first met her, she was real sweet, very, a little bit shy at first. I'll just say it, my first impression of her, she was extremely sweet, very friendly, just knew how to have a conversation. And there was a part of me that was very excited to work with her. And I was very excited because she was actually dating a really long time friend of mine, or somebody I was very close to at the time. I just remember I was like, yeah, I'm very happy for them. And I remember the organization I was part of, on their social media, she came up on the stories, and another friend of mine said, hey, I noticed you're working with this person now. And I said, yeah, she recently just started dating a close friend of mine, and yeah, she's really sweet, she's really awesome. And my friend kind of just boldly looked at me and just said, oh, okay, that's good. And then he just says, I'd be careful with her though if I were you. And I kind of was taken aback by what he said, and I asked him, I said, what do you mean by that? And he dodged the question. He's like, never mind, just pretend I didn't say anything. And then eventually I kept nagging him, and he just came out and said, okay, well, I know this person, they used to go to the same school as me, or same college that I was going to, they were an instructor. And he just started describing almost a completely different version of this person. Like, they were controlling, they were very manipulative, they caused a lot of division, in the school that he was a part of. And I was shocked to hear that. Like, what? Like, no. And I was basing it so much on that good impression I initially got from her. Well, months go by, and just almost every single thing that my friend described, it literally was just coming out into the light. And this person, nothing fully against him, but it's just like, a lot of toxic characteristics really started coming out. And that's just kind of the idea of that. I didn't see that coming. And this is somebody I personally had an interaction with. And that's honestly the reality when it comes to the toxic relationships we get involved with. We don't know who's being honest or who's really, at the end of the day, just being charming. And the way you know somebody's being honest is when they could actually just tell you, and allow you to be vulnerable, which is very difficult at times. But a lot of times it's not about liking somebody for their, just how nice they are, but it's just how effective or how honest and vulnerable can they be with you. Vulnerability is what, at the end of the day, should build trust with another individual. And if any type of relationship, rather if it's romantic, if it's work related, if it's family related, that's honestly the key to trust, is vulnerability, which a lot of toxic people try to really kind of avoid in the beginning stages of any kind of relationship. But moving on into the second point that I want to talk about, which basically kind of leading into the first point, is this person typically is comfortable with their flaws. They're comfortable with the characteristics about them that could come off very toxic, because to them it's normal. But to them, it's just like, this is something that they've really built up on themselves over time. What do I mean when I say this? Well, what I really mean is think of a person who has anger issues, a person who snaps. And when they snap, they get, let's just say if it's a woman who gets a good impression of her boyfriend, they fall, they start building chemistry, they start, head over heels starts happening, and then just out of nowhere, they get into an argument, and then he just snaps. He starts throwing stuff, he starts cussing up a storm, he even, maybe threatens to hit her, or he does something that has this strong impact on the woman. But to him, that's normal. To him, that's just something he's naturally comfortable with. Or it's somebody who they always feel like they need to be in charge. They feel like they need to be over somebody. They need to show their authority over someone. They just never want to fully understand or hear somebody else's point out. They don't, it's just like, I'm always right. Don't tell me I'm wrong. And, as frustrating as that could be, to them, that's just how they're going to communicate their needs. It may not be effective, but to them, that's, you see what I mean? That's normal. And it's not to say that, nobody should have flaws, nobody should have negative traits about them. But I think what makes it different between someone who's toxic is when they really don't have a desire to change. They really don't think anything's wrong with them. But I think that's the beginning stages, or that's kind of where the relationship really starts to go south. And when it makes the relationship toxic within itself is when a person who's dealing with another toxic person they try to get people to see their negative ways and how bad they are. And a toxic person just does not recognize it. And let me tell you something, it's not your job to get them to see that, because it's just going to make you more frustrated. And you know what? It's just going to boost them up even more, rather if you want to believe it or not. So what do we have to really say when it comes to, dealing with people like this? Well, a scripture that really comes to mind, because here's the thing, a lot of times today, it can't just be work relationships or romantic relationships. Sometimes, here's one thing, there's some relationships that we naturally just didn't choose. We were born with certain relationships, and I'm talking about the relationships we have with our mom, with our dad, with our siblings, with our relatives. And sometimes we get involved, or we get into a toxic situation with a family member who just has a toxic side of them, and they just refuse to hold themselves accountable or refuse to be vulnerable, just the negative traits about them. Well, what do we have to understand about this? Well, a scripture that really came to mind, and this is not to kind of just cut down anybody or anything like that, but I believe, the Bible itself kind of talks about how to deal with toxic people in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1-5, where it says, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people." Just the simple statement that it has right there that Paul writes to Timothy. And he notice in the beginning says in the last days people are going to have these toxic characteristics. And at the end of the day, as tough as it is to say, is, it's the truth. And sometimes when we're dealing with a toxic person who's just so comfortable about themselves, you have to ask yourself the question, is this healthy? I even think of someone who was in our family or someone who was in my family, relative of mine, who was dealing with a very toxic situation involving a relationship. But not only was this toxic relationship impacting the person he was involved with, but it was also impacting the people around him, myself including. And as hard as it really was, this person just didn't really think that, hey, what I'm doing is wrong. Hey, what I'm doing, you know what, I'm just throwing out some examples here. I don't care if I'm in a serious relationship. If I think someone's cute, I'm naturally going to flirt, or that's just how I'm naturally this way. And you know what? That's just the common statement I think we hear all the time from a toxic person. This is where we maybe have to really consider what Paul says to avoid these certain people. But getting into the third point of how you know you're dealing with a toxic person, well, I pretty much said it, is they love to play the victim. You know, here's the thing. Everybody loves to play the victim in any type of toxic circumstance or situation. Why is that? Because let me tell you this, being the victim in a situation is almost in a way like a get out of jail free card of, I don't need to hold myself accountable. I don't need to apologize for my actions, my behaviors, or at the end of the day, I don't need to be humble, which at the end of the day, that is a toxic way to look at a victim mindset. But unfortunately, I think that's the common thought process of a victim mindset is I'm the one who's getting attacked, who's been put down. I'm the one who's being accused. I'm the one who needs to be looked at and felt sorry for. I'm the one who needs sympathy. I'm the one who needs empathy. But let me just say it like this. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there are no victims. There are people that have, not to say that that no one's a victim. Everybody goes through something. Everybody goes through a situation where they are a victim in a toxic situation or a toxic relationship. We get that. But let me just say this. There's a difference between being a victim in a situation versus playing the victim. Let me just say this. A toxic person, they're good actors. They really know how to make people feel sorry for them, especially despite their flaws, despite the actions or the mistakes or whatever they did. It's almost like they could just throw that out the window or brush that under the rug, and they're good at getting other people to look at them and feel sorry for them, to side with them and look at you as the perpetrator, when really at the end of the day, they were the person who kind of egged on the situation or pushed that situation. And at the end of the day, it's just like they're very good at what they do. Another thing I got to say is this, is if you're a victim, that doesn't mean you have to stay a victim. If you're in a situation where you're dealing with a toxic person, that doesn't mean you have to stick around and be the victim of that toxic person. If you were in an abusive situation, that doesn't mean you have to carry the baggage of that abuse that you were in that relationship. Here's the thing, hurt people, but let me also say this. That's a very common statement that we hear a lot today. A hurt person typically hurts another person, right? Yes. Well, let me just say this. A toxic person creates another toxic person. That was for free right there. I really want to kind of stress this out to somebody. If you are involved in a person who is toxic, they have a very strong toxic personality, you're in a very abusive relationship with them, and you're in this place where you're just angry, you're hurt, you're going through a place where you just seek justice, most of the time, I don't think a person who is hurt or affected by a toxic person realizes that their victim mindset is just building toxic characteristics. Most hurt people are just people that have been hurt before as well, and we're going to get to that later. Let me just say this, accountability at times is not even really discipline. It's just recognizing your flaw or something that you could have done better in a situation. That's all it really can be at the end of the day, holding yourself accountable. But a lot of times today, I think when a person realizes they have to be held accountable in a situation, a toxic person they look at it as, oh my gosh, I'm getting attacked. People are coming against me. Let me just say this, it's not worth trying to play the victim all the time. You are more than a victim, you're a survivor. You're an overcomer. And that's something that I really want to stress here, because you know what? This is how you really know that you're dealing with a toxic person, is how well they know how to play the victim. Moving on to point number 4, I like to refer to this point as they emotionally drain you. I'll say it like this, a toxic person is, when you are in a relationship with a toxic person, they're not just going to be there to stress you out. No, they are going to put you on a spiritual chokehold. A very common symptom that you're dealing with a toxic person is when you just feel this overwhelming weight from them. Most people that are victims of toxic relationships or a toxic person is when they just feel like they need to abide by that person. They always need to make sure that they're not upsetting them or something like that, especially if they have an unhealthy attachment to a toxic person. Toxic people, they really, going back to point number one, is they're really good at charming you enough to believe that they were once a good person. But all that toxicity that you went through with that person, it's like you realize how much they're emotionally draining you at the end of the day for however long you've been in a relationship with them. You know, the way, I mean, a good example I could really give is this is like a toxic person really looks at abuse, or they look at abuse as a way to kind of just release their baggage. You know, as I mentioned, it's just like a toxic person is basically a hurt and frustrated person, probably more frustrated, if not just as hurt and frustrated as you, releasing on their inner wounds, bleeding on you with whatever they're going through or whatever they've been through. And we're going to get to that in a minute here, but they emotionally drain you. At the end of the day, I think this is the number one mistake victims face from a toxic relationship or a toxic person, is believing that they could fix that. Believing that, hey, I can get them back to where I remember them being at. I can get them back to that nice, sweet person I once saw, that person that told me they loved me, that person that told me that they were never going to betray me, they were never going to let me go, they were never going to backstab me, they were never going to, you know, just that expectation we naturally set on somebody based on that first impression that they gave us. A toxic person, at the end of the day, it's just their baggage being pushed onto you. A good example I could really give, and I've shared this story a few times, I'll share two stories, but I'm going to make this one quick. There was someone I romantically grew strong feelings for. I mean, this was many years ago, and I look back and I'm just like, man, time went by so fast. But there was somebody who I was connected with that I grew strong romantic feelings for. And the reason why I grew such strong feelings for her is just based on the first impression I got from her. How sweet and charming she was, how attractive and how flirtatious, and just like all those emotional needs I was really seeking at the time for a romantic relationship. She was just like hitting all those check marks. But what I did not realize at the end of the day, or what I definitely did not realize during that time, was there was like a strong emotional baggage, of course, that I was carrying, but I know she was carrying during that time. But I wanted to look past that emotional wounds, all those emotional wounds, and all that stuff that I knew she was dealing with, but I just wanted to brush that under the rug and try to pursue her romantically the best way I could, even though I knew the situation was toxic within itself. And no matter how much I stuck around, how much this person would disappoint me and hurt me, I stuck around because at the end of the day, I had this strong belief like she was going to change, and who knows, she was going to go back to the person that I first met, because that's all I was really wanting from her at the end of the day. But each time I was around her, each time I would spend time with her and talk to her, I just felt so, oh my gosh, just overwhelmingly drained. And I look back and I was really holding a lot of this against her. But I look back and I'm just like, man, if I had to hold myself accountable to that relationship, you know, back then, I would have sat back and I would have said, you know what? It was wrong of me to put that expectation on her. And sometimes if you're a victim of a toxic person, you have to hold yourself accountable enough to say, I'm no longer going to put these expectations on this person. I'm not going to put the expectations of them changing, fixing themselves for you in a very selfish way. And it even makes me think of a boss who, I remember a former boss of mine. It was somebody who I used to work with. And I remember when I first met him, I've shared about him before as well in one of my past episodes, but all I thought about was just the great times I had with him. The first initial moments I had, how smart he was, the job interview. I was so excited to work that job, but at the time I did not realize all the turmoil and all the hardship he was going through. And each time I would come to work, it's just like he would just release that toxicity, mostly on me because I was the only guy working in that office. It was nothing but women. And I felt like since I was a male figure and he, you know, and I'm leading into the final point here, I actually ended up learning some things about him that made a lot of sense about some of my most toxic interactions with this former employer of mine. A lot of the stuff he would do, it would just just so badly stress me out, to the point where I remember one time I just would have anxiety when I would wake up the next day because I was afraid he was going to do something. But I ended up realizing something about him is that he had a past. Based on other conversations I've had with former coworkers, is he had a past, and that's the final point. Is the way you know that you're dealing with a toxic person is you end up learning that they have a past. Now, not every toxic person has to go through an extreme traumatic event in their life. In most cases they do. But I think when you learn about somebody who has a strong impact over you in your life, you actually learn that there's so much more to their story than what you know. And that's exactly what we really need to speak on here today, is as much as we want to hold resentment, hold bitterness, and hold anger towards a person who might have emotionally or physically or even spiritually abused us, we have to know that they are human beings just like us, that have been through certain events in their life or have gone who's trying to get through life just like you. But a lot of times I think that a person who goes through life and becomes, builds up toxicity, it's just like they don't really know how to surrender those hurts. They don't know how to surrender that heavy weight that they've been carrying for so long. And this is what really reminds me of the scripture that I was writing about, or the scripture that simply just came to mind. One of my favorite verses in the Bible as we end in today's episode is Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12, where it says, "For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." We are in a spiritual battle every single day. And I think the troubling truth that the world does not recognize today is how evident the spiritual realm is. And I described the 5 signs that you're dealing with a toxic person. And this basically is leading into an answer of what I'm really describing, and that is a narcissist. You're dealing with a narcissist. And that is basically what a narcissist is. It's a person that has a strong emotional weight on them. It's a strong emotional weight of trauma, of frustration, of rejection, of past abuse, of pain, of hurt, of countless days staying up, sleepless nights, and, just the living in the victim mentality, because they never faced the justice that they thought they were going to face. So therefore they're carrying that hurt that was passed on to them. And now they're bringing it onto the other people that they're surrounding themselves with. And that's exactly what we need to recognize today in our relationships, is when you're dealing with a toxic person, maybe the healthy thing to do is to step away, cut that person off when the circumstances are true. But at the end of the day, we have to understand we're in a spiritual battle here. And that's basically what narcissism is at the end of the day. It's a hurt person coming in and trying to hurt another person they're getting close to. And this is something that I really put a lot of thought into for today's episode. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments of what you believe you've dealt with a toxic person or a toxic relationship. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in today's episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe. But with all that being said, God bless.